Israel has the most secretive nuclear weapons program in the world, but officially it doesn't exist. It's the only country with them that has never acknowledged having them, which is part of a deliberate strategy.
Does Israel have nuclear capabilities and nuclear weapons? Yes or no?
Does Israel have or not have nuclear weapons?
Why should we clarify it?
Is it because of the Holocaust that you should be allowed to have nuclear weapons?
You know what? This interview was finished now.
Israel's process of developing nukes was one of the most covert and controversial of any nation and involves espionage, clashes with the United States, smuggling and theft of materials from other countries, as well as hidden alliances, which allowed them to become the first and only nation in the Middle East to obtain the most powerful weapon humanity has ever created. This is the full story of how Israel got nuclear weapons. Their program began around the time of the country's founding in 1948. With their first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion reportedly being obsessed with obtaining them as the ultimate deterrent against the Arab states. Many of the world's top nuclear scientists and those who led the US's Manhattan Project were Jewish, and Ben-Gurion was quoted saying that because Einstein, Oppenheimer and Edward Teller were Jewish, that they could also achieve the same for Israel. Though Einstein had no interest in helping anyone develop nuclear weapons and also didn't support a militarized Jewish state, fearing it would create endless conflicts. Oppenheimer became disillusioned with nukes after the Manhattan Project and also wasn't particularly interested in helping Israel. But Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, would provide them with some advice and help with connections, though he didn't give them any technical help. In 1949, a new unit of the IDF began searching for uranium deposits in the southern region of Israel called the Negev Desert. After a few years, they developed a new technique to extract heavy water that was even more advanced than the US. They sold these patents to the French for their nuclear weapons program, and this began the Israeli-French cooperation on nuclear science, which would be crucial for both countries. Israeli scientists were also allowed to observe the French nuclear weapons program, and they were the only foreign scientists able to freely roam the French facilities. In 1956, the Egyptian president Abdel Nasser took control of the Suez Canal, one of the most important shipping routes in the world, which was previously controlled by the French and British. France and the UK proposed that Israel should attack Egypt and invade the Sinai Peninsula, so that France and Britain could then also invade Egypt to look like peacekeepers, but with the hidden agenda of retaking the Suez Canal for themselves. As part of this cooperation, France would then sell and help Israel build their own nuclear reactor. Months later, the plan was put into action. Israel, followed by Britain and France, invaded Egypt, but they quickly came under heavy pressure from the US, Soviet Union, and the UN. The three countries were forced to withdraw from Egypt, marking a turning point where the US and Soviets now cemented themselves as leading world superpowers over Britain and France, who had just been weakened by World War II and now, since the Suez Crisis, been humiliated. Despite this, the French and Israeli relationship remained strong, as they were both now more determined than ever to obtain nuclear weapons and also didn't have great relations with the US at the time. The French government were also strong supporters of Israel, with the Prime Minister of France reportedly telling an aide, "We owe the bomb to them," and their Chief of Defense Staff saying, "We must give them this to guarantee their safety." The two nations continued with classified agreements and in 1957 began to build the large plutonium reactor in the Negev Desert near the city of Dimona. It's now called the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center, but is also just referred to as Dimona. In 1959, early in its construction, it was spotted by an American U-2 spy plane. Eisenhower's administration grew suspicious, but Israel said to them it was just a textile factory. Israel then publicly declared it to be peaceful and used for desalinating seawater for agriculture. The Israeli politician Shimon Peres, who would later become prime minister in the 80s and again in the 90s, and then president in the 2000s, was the architect of the Israeli-French alliance in the 50s and led Israel's nuclear weapons program, with the reactor facility later being named after him. By the late 50s, he established the early version of an intelligence service which would later be called LACHEM, whose purpose was to search the world and secure technology, materials, and equipment needed for nuclear weapons by any means necessary. By 1960, France successfully tested its first nuclear weapon in the Sahara Desert of its colony of Algeria, becoming the fourth nation to obtain the bomb. Over the next 6 years, France tested a total of 17 nukes in Algeria, with Israeli scientists being present at most of them. They were said to have had unlimited access to the data and results, which was a massive help for their own program. The new French president, Charles de Gaulle, wanted to distance himself from the Israelis and officially stopped supplying them uranium in 1963, but all French assistance ended completely by 1966. As Israel's nuclear weapons program was making great progress, it would soon face some serious problems into the 60s, when US President Kennedy grew concerned that the Israelis were developing atomic weapons, and he clashed with David Ben-Gurion over the issue. Kennedy and the CIA demanded that the facility be inspected thoroughly. Ben-Gurion repeatedly ignored and delayed his responses, trying to avoid the subject, but Kennedy would not budge and became more annoyed by the situation, issuing ultimatums to end all support of Israel. Eventually, Ben-Gurion agreed to allow only US inspectors to visit for the first time in 1961. Inspectors were only shown staged sections of Dimona. Fake temporary walls were built to hide elevator shafts that led to secret underground floors where chemical reprocessing plants were creating weapons-grade plutonium. The former Mossad agent Rafi Eitan admitted that they fooled inspectors with a bogus control center built over the real one with fake control panels and measurements.
Was this the justification also for concealing the flaws of the plutonium reprocessing areas from the Americans, the inspectors, when they came?
You're having a dialogue with yourself, not with me.
But that's been documented in a number of books.
Ask the question to yourself, not to me.
But is it not true?
I don't have to answer the question, Stephen.
The second inspection was held the next year in 1962, but in 63, just days after Kennedy sent a second letter to Ben-Gurion demanding more inspections, he resigned as Prime Minister, which surprised the world as he never properly explained why, besides just saying personal reasons, though this was likely due to several political scandals he was facing and fractures within his party. Then, months later, President Kennedy was assassinated. His vice president and automatic successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, didn't press nearly as hard on the Israelis and is widely regarded as one of the most pro-Israeli presidents in US history. Inspections would continue, with the third being held in 1964 and one each year until 1969, but they weren't under the strict conditions that Kennedy had wanted. Israel's nuclear weapons program would succeed during this period, and many credit their success to Johnson's favorability to them. Kennedy's assassination, and especially his successor, did end up being extremely convenient for Israel's weapons program. Some speculate there might have been a connection, but hard evidence of this has never emerged, and most historians and experts don't believe there is a connection. At this point, most of the world was unaware of Israel's nuclear program, besides government intelligence agencies. Inside Israel, there were rumors, but the military censor over journalist reporting kept it under wraps. The media has always been an important way for nations to shape narratives, but even in countries with a more free press, there is still significant bias, which can have a similar effect. An example of this can be seen in the recent Israeli-US attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities, as many debate how much damage was actually done. You can see that left-leaning coverage highlights Israel as the aggressor, using terms like war crimes and having skepticism over the actual damage done to the facilities, whereas right-leaning outlets talk about Israel's precision and success, while downplaying Iran's missile attacks as underperforming. This is the same story, but reported on in very different ways. Being objective and presenting all sides fairly is always the goal on this channel, which is why I wanted to partner with Ground News, as it's such a powerful tool to identify bias in the media. They're a news website and app that gathers stories from all around the world, bringing every angle and perspective together on today's most talked about issues. It also shows the political leanings of outlets, their factuality, and who owns them. My favorite feature is called the blind spot feed, which shows you stories that are underreported on by the left and right. So if you head to groundnews.com/SB, you can get 40% off of the unlimited access Vantage plan subscription using my link, which is also in the description and pinned comments, or you can just scan this QR code. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Meanwhile, Israel would undertake many secret operations to obtain nuclear materials from other countries both with and without their permission. In 2005, top-secret documents revealed that Britain had secretly made hundreds of shipments of restricted nuclear materials to Israel in the 50s and 60s. These included reprocessing chemicals, samples of fissile uranium and plutonium, 20 tons of heavy water, and enriched lithium-6, which is used to boost fission bombs and fuel hydrogen bombs. This was covertly done through a fake Norwegian shell company, and though Britain initially denied this, in 2006 they would admit that they knew the shipments were going to Israel. Argentina also sold Israel 90 tons of yellowcake uranium oxide, which the US unsuccessfully tried to stop. In 1965, at least 200 pounds of highly enriched weapons-grade uranium was missing from a private US company called NUMEC, based in Apollo, Pennsylvania. They processed enriched uranium for the US government. This would become known as the Apollo or NUMEC affair. The facility had more missing uranium than any other similar company in the US. What raised suspicions is that the company's president, Zalman Shapiro, was a Jewish-American scientist that was also a well-known Zionist and strong supporter of Israel. He had business relationships with many high-ranking officials in the Israeli government and had contracts to build nuclear-powered generators for them. He was also known to have met senior Israeli officials at his home. The CIA, FBI, and others in the US intelligence community believed that the uranium was diverted to Israel. The strongest evidence that a diversion may have occurred comes from an FBI declassified but heavily redacted document showing an FBI interview of a NUMEC employee who claimed that he saw an unusual truck loading canisters of uranium at night, which was always done earlier in the day. When he read the shipping documents, it said the destination was a Greek ship in New York destined for Israel. While reading this, a redacted individual then told him the shipping order was confidential and not for his eyes before an armed guard ordered him away from the loading dock, and he was later threatened that he would be fired if he didn't keep his mouth shut about what he saw. As well as this, at least 4 senior intelligence agents of Israel's Mossad visited this facility, including Rafi Eitan. The Mossad spy later confirmed to be involved in acquiring nuclear secrets and materials from other countries for Israel's program. The US believed there was no other reason for him to visit the Apollo plant besides acquiring nuclear material. And the Jerusalem Post surprisingly and openly credited Eitan with diverting uranium from an American nuclear fuel plant. A US nuclear official described it as one of the most glaring cases of diverted nuclear material that was ignored because of the consequences. The FBI, CIA, and others investigated for decades, but no one was ever charged. They concluded that while they can't rule out that a diversion occurred, concrete evidence was also never found. However, some experts do believe the missing uranium had leaked into the environment through faulty pipes over the decades, and significant amounts have recently been found contaminating the environment in Apollo, which could account for some of it. This remains a controversial and debated mystery to this day as to whether the uranium was diverted to Israel, but the majority of the documents pertaining to this still remain highly classified and unreleased by the US government. The Mossad agent Rafi Eitan, involved in the NUMEC Apollo affair, would later become the head of Israel's Lakem intelligence agency, founded in the 50s by Shimon Peres to acquire technology and intelligence for nuclear weapons from other countries, and they would be involved in many controversies. Eitan was also the handler of Jonathan Pollard, a Jewish-American intelligence analyst for the US Navy who was discovered to be selling significant amounts of US state secrets to Israel to help their nuclear weapons program. This later forced Israel to shut down Lakem in 1986 and formally apologized to the US for their involvement in what was called the Pollard Affair. He was imprisoned in the US for 30 years and after his release moved to Israel in 2020, where he was granted citizenship and welcomed as a hero by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Richard Kelly Smith was a US aerospace engineer and president of a company called Milco. He was also indicted the same year as Pollard when he was found smuggling 15 shipments of 800 nuclear weapon switches to Israel. His company was found to be a front for Lachem to acquire nuclear materials. The switches he smuggled were sent to a company owned by the Israeli billionaire Arnon Milchan, who was one of the most successful Hollywood movie producers of all time and also turned out to be a spy for Israel's Lachem agency. He admitted to using his connections to promote South Africa's apartheid regime in exchange for them helping Israel acquire uranium. In a 2013 interview, he said, "Do you know what it's like to be a kind of 20-something and his country lets him be James Bond?" Shimon Peres in an interview praised Milchan's work as an operative, stating that he recruited him personally and that his numerous intelligence operations gave Israel a huge advantage strategically and technologically. Milchan has also been a longtime close friend of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently on trial for allegations of bribery and corruption, which involves Milchan giving Netanyahu $250,000 worth of gifts and throwing him fundraisers in exchange for tax exemptions. After all of this international smuggling, around 1965, the Dimona plant was complete and now able to create weapons-grade plutonium. Israel is believed to have completed its first operational nuclear weapon in December 1966, becoming the 6th country in the world to develop them. They were said to have made 2 crude bombs ready to use during the 1967 Six-Day War, which was mainly against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan reportedly told aides during this that Israel now had the nuclear option to deter the Arabs. According to Israeli military sources, the Prime Minister secretly ordered the 2 crude bombs to be ready. One official said the operation was called Spider because the devices had pointy appendages and contraptions sticking out of them. They were reportedly loaded onto trucks ready to be driven to the Egyptian border and would only be detonated if Arab forces defeated the Israeli defenses. The New York Times also reported that in the days before the Six-Day War, when tensions were running high, Israel considered setting up and detonating a nuclear bomb in Egypt's Sinai Desert as a warning to the Arab states. Though the 2 bombs were ready, the order was never given, as Israel swiftly defeated the Egyptians and seized the entire Sinai Peninsula, which it would hold for the next 15 years until it was handed back in a peace treaty. Israel's defense minister ordered the production of 5 nukes per year, and the words "never again" were said to be etched onto the first warhead in both English and Hebrew. The CIA and NSA, who were spying on Israeli communications, also confirmed that the Israeli Air Force were practicing bombing runs of how to deliver nuclear weapons. Israel still continued its secret missions to acquire materials from other countries, and in 1968, the Mossad undertook Operation Plumbat, where they covertly purchased 200 tons of yellowcake uranium from a Belgian mining colony in what's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The amount of uranium was enough to power the Dimona reactor for up to 10 years. 1969 saw one of the most important events that shaped Israel's nuclear weapons policy up to today. US President Nixon stopped all inspections of the Dimona plant and reached a secret unwritten agreement with Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir that if they don't test their nukes or admit to having them, the US would tolerate Israel's possession of them, and they also would not press Israel to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nixon's national security advisor Henry Kissinger said in a memorandum that Israel is more likely than any other country to actually use its nuclear weapons, and that trying to force them to disarm would not work, so pretending to not know about them would be the best strategy. Every president since has respected this agreement, and US federal employees with clearance are prohibited from talking about Israel's nukes. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War against mainly Egypt and Syria, Israel's defense minister Moshe Dayan reportedly authorized a nuclear alert and ordered 13 atomic bombs to be ready, and the Israeli ambassador informed President Nixon that very serious conclusions may occur if the US did not airlift supplies. Initially, Nixon and Kissinger planned to let the Arabs and Israelis fight out before getting involved, but once it became apparent how serious the Israelis were about using their nukes if they were in danger, Nixon quickly changed his stance and airlifted the supplies. In 1963 and 66, Israel did reportedly test non-nuclear zero-yield devices underground in the Negev desert. These are completed sections of a bomb but without the nuclear material to check if the components work, but without creating a massive explosion. Though they did benefit significantly from all the French test data and promised the US not to do their own tests, they still needed to test their newer tactical and thermonuclear devices somehow. But Israel is by far the smallest country in the world that possesses them, and has nowhere they can safely test one without contaminating their own land and breaking their promise to the US. Almost every other nuclear-armed nation has either massive empty deserts, colonies, or remote islands in the middle of oceans, but Israel has none of these. Luckily for them, one of their closest allies at the time, South Africa, under the apartheid regime, had just the place. The Prince Edward Islands, situated between South Africa and Antarctica. The two nations entered into a secret alliance as they both had active weapons programs and each had what the other needed. Israel had skilled nuclear scientists and technology to create the bombs, and South Africa had significant uranium deposits and possession of these islands perfect for testing away from the world's eye. Or so they thought. The United States had 12 Vela satellites orbiting Earth specifically designed to detect nuclear explosions. They had a 100% accuracy record and correctly identified all 41 unauthorized tests carried out by China and France who hadn't signed the Test Ban Treaty. On the 22nd of September 1979, one of those satellites detected the unique light signature of a nuclear explosion around the Prince Edward Islands, and this is called the Vela incident. The IDF sent ships with military and nuclear personnel to the islands around the time of the explosion, and South Africa, who didn't have nuclear weapons yet at the time, unusually placed their navy on high alert around the same dates. The Israelis chose a time when they thought no Vela satellites were over the area. What they didn't know is one satellite marked as retired was still actually there. Although they did it when a typhoon had created a large cloud over the islands, this cloud moved just in time for the flash to be detectable. The bomb, which was unusually clean with little radioactive fallout, was believed to be either a smaller tactical nuke or potentially a neutron bomb, which is a unique type of thermonuclear weapon that has a large burst of deadly radiation that goes through buildings and armor but has minimal explosive damage to structures and is seen as a cleaner, less destructive nuke. Dieter Gerhardt was the commander of a South African naval base at the time. He was later convicted for spying on behalf of the Soviet Union, but upon his release claimed that the flash was a joint Israeli-South African nuclear test called Operation Phoenix. He said it was clean and not meant to be detected, but they were not as smart as they thought and the weather changed, so the Americans were able to pick it up. The US Air Force collected samples from the atmosphere in the area and confirmed radioactive fallout contamination consistent with a nuclear explosion. US President Jimmy Carter was tasked to carry out an investigation, but many claim he covered up the incident because he had recently brokered a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, where the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt. So acknowledging that Israel were conducting nuclear tests would hurt his credibility as a peacekeeper. He also worried about his relationship with Israel and chances for re-election in the following year's 1980 campaign. His investigation concluded that it was, quote, probably not from a nuclear explosion, but it was widely criticized for being a politically motivated cover-up to avoid complicating relationships with Israel. President Carter later wrote in his diary that US scientists believed it was indeed an Israeli test. Up until this point, Israel's nuclear weapons were mostly a secret from the public, although rumors and speculation had circulated and many governments were aware of them. But in 1986, everything changed when Mordechai Vanunu, an Israeli technician who worked at the Dimona plant on material for their nuclear weapons, developed a strong dislike for the Israeli government. One day, he snuck in a camera and took 57 photographs of the plant's secret areas before quitting his job to travel the world and converting to Christianity. He unsuccessfully tried to sell his story in Sydney, Australia, where a reporter tipped off the Israelis about what he was trying to do. Vanunu then went to London, where he sold his story to the Sunday Times, but that reporter from Sydney also sold a shorter version of his story to a tabloid called the Sunday Mirror, whose owner was Robert Maxwell, a Jewish strong supporter of Israel and Zionism with suspicious connections to the Mossad, leading many at the time to believe him to be an agent or asset for them.
To order an immediate inquiry into the alleged relationship between the Israeli intelligence service and Robert Maxwell.
He was even buried in Israel, with an Israeli president, prime minister, and several heads of the Mossad attending his funeral. His daughter is the infamous Ghislaine Maxwell, who has been all over the news in recent years and is also suspected of having ties to Mossad. Robert reportedly told them about Vanunu, and the Mossad then had a female agent lure Vanunu to Rome in what's called a honeypot operation. Thinking they were going on a date, he was then drugged, abducted, and taken back to Israel by ship. Robert tried to bury and discredit Vanunu's story, but it was already too late, as days later the Sunday Times published Vanunu's full story, revealing to the world intricate details of Israel's nuclear weapons program, and that they had already produced more than 100 warheads. Vanunu was interrogated and held under harsh conditions before being sentenced in a secret trial to 18 years in prison for treason and espionage. He served 11 years in solitary confinement. Since his release in 2004, he's been under heavy surveillance and is barred from leaving the country or speaking to foreigners, and has also been arrested and raided many times. Though every year he applies for permission to leave, he has always been denied. In Israel, he is seen as a divisive figure, with some seeing him as a traitor and others seeing him as a hero and whistleblower. Today, Israel is believed to possess the nuclear triad of land, air, and sea deployed nuclear weapons, with an estimated 200 to 300, including at least 100 of the most powerful thermonuclear devices. They have the German-designed Dolphin-class submarines, which can launch cruise missiles, the US-designed F-15 and F-16 fighter jets, which can carry bombs, and the Israeli-designed Jericho 2 and 3 intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Israel is very unique in that they are one of the only few countries that have built nuclear reactors but have never used them for civilian energy purposes. They have 2 reactors, Dimona in the desert, which is highly secretive, not open to inspections or safeguards, and is widely believed to have only a military purpose, producing material for bombs. They also have a much smaller reactor called Sorek near Tel Aviv, which is open to inspections and does follow international regulations, and this is used for medical research. Israeli politicians are very careful to never acknowledge their nuclear capabilities, and they usually will evade the subject.
Does Israel have nuclear capabilities and nuclear weapons? Yes or no?
We've always said that we won't be the first to introduce it, so we haven't introduced it.
But that's
And
not an answer to the question. Do you have them or do you not?
Of any country. It's as good an answer as you're going to get. But I'll tell you one thing, Chris, and I think it's important. You know, Iran.
There are 2 main examples where they have slipped up. In 1998, Shimon Peres, who led their program and later became prime minister and president, said in a speech that Israel built the nuclear option, not in order to have a Hiroshima, but an Oslo, referring to the Oslo Peace Accords. The second and one of the most famous slip-ups was in 2006. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said on live German television that Iran are aspiring to have nuclear weapons as America, France, Israel, Russia. A recording of this doesn't exist, but it was widely reported on as the biggest accidental confirmation, as he included Israel while listing off other nuclear-armed nations.
Does Israel have or not have nuclear weapons?
Why should we clarify it? If the suspicion prevents them from attacking us, okay, it's enough.
But it's a simple question. Do you or don't you have nuclear weapons?
I said Israel has said clearly that we are not going to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East.
Are you saying you do not have nuclear weapons?
I answered it. We are not going to introduce it.
But
Why
it's
should
been well
we?
documented. Even Israeli historians have written about it, have said that there is a nuclear Israeli bomb. Indeed,
There
the
are
CIA
different-
has said that as well. Prime Minister Olmert himself said it before he retracted his comments.
No, he never said anything like it. I'm sorry. He never said anything. No Israeli ever said it. And historians, they have different histories.
There have been some smaller, more recent examples. On October 9th, 2023, an Israeli lawmaker in a tweet alluded to the use of a Jericho missile or doomsday weapon to be used on Gaza before the introduction of forces. In November 2023, a government minister was asked in a radio interview about dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza and responded saying that's one way, to which Prime Minister Netanyahu suspended him, saying his words are detached from reality. In 1966, Israel created a policy where nuclear weapons could be used if any of these 4 red lines were crossed: if a military successfully penetrated Israel's populated areas, if the Israeli Air Force was destroyed, if Israeli cities were exposed to massive, devastating air attacks, chemical or biological weapons, or if a nuclear weapon was used against them on their territory. In these cases, their last resort is known internally as the Samson option, which is a strategy of massive nuclear retaliation if any country invaded or destroyed much of Israel. This is a reference to a biblical story where an Israelite called Samson brought down an entire temple to take out all the invaders with him as a sort of self-destruct tactic. Their ballistic missiles are buried so deep underground that they could survive a nuclear attack, and of course these submarines can be hidden anywhere in the oceans to retaliate no matter what's happening on land. This is the main reason any country wants nuclear weapons, and why to this day no country that has nukes has ever been properly invaded or toppled, as the nuclear last resort is the ultimate insurance policy. Israel has very strict laws on their media, and outlets must submit articles about sensitive national security topics to the military for approval, who can redact and censor parts or ban and blackball those who break the rules. Any talk about their nuclear weapons can have serious consequences, so journalists often use words like doomsday weapons or the Samson option. Israel completed their first nuclear weapons a few years before the Non-Proliferation Treaty started. This is the international treaty where countries agree not to develop or spread such weapons, and essentially means that only the first 5 countries are allowed to have them. So Israel had a brief window where they could have declared them with no consequences. But as time passed and they refused to sign, they continued to not acknowledge having them, and the secret agreement with the US would then mean that they wouldn't be pressured to sign it. 191 countries have signed the treaty, and Israel is one of only 5 countries that have not, with the others being India and Pakistan, who both have nukes, South Sudan, who only recently became a country in 2011, and North Korea, who initially signed it but is the only country to withdraw in 2003 before creating their nukes. Arab nations have accused the US of double standards in criticizing Iran's nuclear program while turning a blind eye to Israel's possession of them. Either way, if Israel signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty with their nukes, they would instantly be violating the treaty and have to receive sanctions. Or if they acknowledged their nuclear weapons without signing, the US would, in theory, by their own laws, have to cut them off from the roughly $3 to $4 billion per year of military aid and funding that they receive. So with their relationship, this is unlikely, and the president can waive this law, but it would put the US in an awkward position. So this is why Israel won't acknowledge their weapons or sign the NPT, and is the only country on Earth operating in this nuclear grey zone.